Good evening. I am Jessie Kornberg, the President and CEO of the Skirball Cultural Center. I'm coming to you this evening from our replica of the Bima of the New Synagogue in Berlin inside our museum, where we tell the story of 4,000 years of Jewish experience, diaspora, of refuge, of relocation, and the rebuilding of community over and over again. As I come to you tonight, and I suspect many of you, am occupied with thoughts of 18 lost children and 2 lost teachers in a classroom in Texas. The loss is unimaginable and heartbreaking, and halfway around the world, countless other children and teachers are, even tonight, facing equally terrifying circumstances, and it is their conflict that brings us together. Before I hand the program off to our beloved partner at Writer's Block, Andrea Grossman, I want to just say it's never a bad time to feel grateful for the love in your life. But tonight especially, I am grateful, and I hope you can feel gratitude as well for those in your life who bring you joy and comfort and a sense of safety. We all seek that here at the Skirball. We want to be a place of safety and of welcome. I hope we can provide those moments of meaning and understanding and community tonight. With that, it's my pleasure to turn over this Zoom screen to, as I say, our beloved partner from Writer's Block, Andrea Grossman. Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks so much, Jessie. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, all of you in the audience, with former United States Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, and Georgetown professor Angela Stent. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now nearing the close of our 26th season. Look no further than the 2 women here tonight to understand Ukraine, Russia, and their leaders. Marie Yovanovitch was our recent ambassador to Ukraine. She's a scholar of Russian history and served on the Russia desk for the Department of State. In her new book, Lessons from the Edge, Ambassador Yovanovitch tells her own remarkable story in a book that I sped through. It's a deeply personal exploration of her years in foreign service and her personal triumphs and sacrifices along the way. And speaking of those sacrifices, you'll want to read about her decision to testify in the first impeachment trial, which was also a triumph, right? As she discussed the intimidation she faced by the State Department and by the president. I love Lessons from the Edge because it's got it all. Adventure in places not on my vacation list, some revealing personal detail, some awkward lessons learned, and of course, great insight into the Ukraine situation that has consumed our headlines and our fears for the future of Europe. You will have questions. Email them to reservations@writersblockpresents.com and we'll try to get to them. It's difficult to come up with someone who would know more about Ukraine and Russia than Professor Angela Stent, author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. Now a professor emerita of government and foreign service at Georgetown, she served as a national intelligence officer on Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. Her book, Putin's World, is arguably the most definitive page-turner about the psychopath in the Kremlin and his relationship with the rest of the world, especially now, considering his bloodlust in reclaiming Ukraine. Putin's World has won countless distinguished awards. All this, and Angela Stent was a member of the senior advisory panel for NATO's Supreme Allied Command in Europe. I urge you to visit our website to lead you to Skylight Books, who have copies of Marie Yovanovitch's book, Lessons from the Edge, with signed book plates. And you can order Angela Stent's Putin's World from them while you're at it. Email questions to reservations@writersblockpresents.com, and we'll try to get to them. Thank you so much. And I'm so thrilled to present Angela Stent and Marie Yovanovitch.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted and honored to be doing this, particularly with such a wonderful author here. She has written a compelling and a very important book, and she is a very courageous person, and that emerges really on every page of the book that you read. We will get to a discussion of Ukraine, but I do want to start off by asking a question that one shall always ask an author, which is why they chose to write this book and what the experience was like. After all, you wrote many State Department cables, memos, and other articles in your professional career, and yet writing a book is a very different experience. So maybe you could just start off by sharing with us your experience of what it was like to write the book and why you wrote it.
Yeah. So I have newfound, I've always loved books and reading and authors, but I now have newfound respect for people like you who have written many books. I found it to be, this was a memoir, so that's a little bit different. Very introspective. It was kind of a hard journey because I was kind of working things out a little bit as well. And I found it to be a difficult process, in part because I didn't know what I was doing. As you said, I've written 10-page memos, but I haven't written a 300-page book. And what do you put in? What do you keep out? How do you tie it all together so that it's hopefully interesting, as well as a substantive read for the reader? And the reason that I wrote the book is that after my public testimony, I got thousands of letters from the American public, thanking me for my service, but also asking me more about myself and, what did I do and what were the challenges and what was it like being in the Foreign Service and so forth, and what do diplomats do? And I thought that this might be an opportunity through my stories to talk about diplomacy and the importance of diplomacy and why it matters to every American and what we do for every American.
Well, and I'm so glad you wrote the book, obviously. And this was already alluded to, and you said this is a memoir. So the personal part of your story is very, very moving, particularly what you write about being the child of refugees from both Nazism and communism and growing up in different places, and their constant consciousness of the fact that they might not stay in whichever place they were for a very long time. It spoke very much to me. I'm the child of refugees from Nazism, and I know what that feeling is like from interacting with my parents and the rest of my family. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how that experience of growing up as the child of refugees influenced your view of what it means to be an American, and also influenced you to want to join the Foreign Service.
Yeah. So I think, Angela, you really put your finger on it. I think there's the lived experience. I mean, neither of us experienced World War II, obviously, and all the horrors of authoritarian rule. But there's also the learned experience that one gets from one's parents. And so there's little things like to this day, I can't throw anything away to the despair of all I know, because you never know when you might need that piece of aluminum foil. Everything is repurposed because it's sinful to waste things when there is need in the world. And that was the world that my parents grew up in. And, on a more kind of, on a different note, my parents were very grateful that they finally found refuge in the United States, that they had a place that was where they could be free, where they could worship as they wanted to. That was really important to them, that they could express their views, where they had good jobs, and where there was opportunity for me and my brother. And they were, they knew what it was to live under an authoritarian leader. And they could see the contrast. I mean, we don't live in a perfect country. We are still trying to make our union more perfect, but it is far better than certainly than any authoritarian country. And my parents really valued that and brought us up not only to be grateful, but to understand that we were privileged to be here and that we need to give back. And so, when I was thinking about what to do when I grow up, I took a bunch of detours after college, as one does, but I, was thinking about, how do I give back to this country that has given our family so much? And I thought about the Foreign Service because it married up my desire to serve with my interest in history and in politics and in travel and in meeting people from different cultures and, finding out about the world. So it seemed like a good career for me. And in the end, it certainly was.
Yes, but along the way, you really had some tough experiences being a woman in the Foreign Service. So that's what I wanted to turn to next. You write graphically about how difficult it was, the obstacles against you, that people didn't expect you to succeed. I remember a few years ago listening to the first class of women who graduated from the Georgetown School of Foreign Service in the 50s and wanted to go into the Foreign Service. And they all found that the minute that they got engaged, they weren't even allowed, even if they passed the exams, they couldn't go into the Foreign Service. So if you were married, forget about it. But if you weren't married and you were single, it was still very, very difficult. And the prejudices were enormous. So could you share with the audience some of your experiences and the challenges you faced and how you overcame them and got to be an ambassador to 3 countries?
Yeah. So, it's still kind of hard for me to talk about. And I really wrestled with myself whether I should include it. But all of my female colleagues told me I needed to. And, of course, I would share chapters with them and they would vet things, is this really true? Was this the way, this is the way I remember it. And, we went back and forth because I didn't want it to be exaggerated in any way. And it's really hard to talk about because it wasn't, at least in my experience, I didn't experience kind of the overt, being chased around a table or other more serious forms of harassment. But I mean, by folks in the state, men in the State Department. But nevertheless, there was this pervasive feeling that is a little bit hard to identify, that we didn't belong, that we didn't have a seat at the table, that we shouldn't be there, that we were taking jobs away from men, that, women couldn't be real Foreign Service officers, they couldn't be political officers. And that was something that was articulated, actually, with no, thought that this might be an inappropriate comment. And so, how did I deal with that? I, looked for opportunities. I worked hard. I kept my head down and I didn't complain. And I think this is something that, if I were coming up today, probably, would be different in the way that people respond to some of those challenges. And, I was also, I think it's important to note, the beneficiary of a class action lawsuit. So the State Department fought a class action lawsuit for decades. And in the end, in the 1990s, early 1990s, it was found that the State Department systematically discriminated against women in how they set up the exam, in how they hire, so in the examination process, in how they hired women, in how they put women into their specialties, in how they assigned women to jobs, and how they promoted them. So pretty much across the board, it was a slam dunk that the State Department discriminated. But that was not a welcome, shall we say, ruling. And the State Department, as I said, fought it for many years. And I think there was a real feeling among those in power, all of my bosses, right, that this was most unfair, that women were getting this leg up, an unfair leg up. And so although I was given the opportunity to take advantage of the remedy, which I took, I never shared that with anybody in the State Department because I was worried that people would discriminate against me. Again, not only because I was a woman, but because I moved forward as a result of this lawsuit. This was true until I wrote the book. And Angela, I have proved myself over and over again in the State Department. I was an ambassador 3 times, as you noted, and yet still the gaslighting is still really strong in your head. And so I just didn't share it with anybody until I wrote this book, because I thought it was important for people to know that sometimes, working hard, being enthusiastic, looking for opportunities, sometimes that's not enough. And sometimes you need legal remedies so that our institutions live up to our ideals.
Yeah. So important. Let's talk now about your first overseas posting in Somalia, which was very tough in very difficult times. And can you say something about that and how that experience influenced you throughout the rest of your career, including the lessons you learned from that then you applied when you were in the post-Soviet world?
Yeah. So, in Mogadishu in 1986, I was at the bottom of the embassy. I was one of two women officers at the embassy. Everybody else was male, including all of the men that I supervised, about 60 guys. And so again, it was sort of a matter of keeping your head down, working hard, trying to do the best that you could in a very alien environment. I mean, I was coming from Manhattan, where I had been in advertising and marketing. And all of a sudden, I was in Mogadishu, Somalia, at the end of the world. Although people would quickly correct me and say, not the end of the world, but you can see it from here. And I was responsible for providing along with others, for providing the administrative support for the embassy. Embassies can be little cities, and especially in a place like Somalia, where the government essentially doesn't work and there are no services. It was my responsibility to run the motor pool, and the motor pool not only provided vehicles for workers, but provided diesel for the generators that we used because there was no electricity, provided water to the various compounds because there was no water service, picked up garbage because there was no garbage service. So you get the idea. There were a lot of challenges in Somalia, and I was responsible in part to try to make things run. And that was a real challenge. And in this very male-dominated world, what I found was that I was obviously not a man, but I was also, it was unacceptable really for me to be treated as a woman because I was a woman who was in charge and was representing the US government. And so I was kind of given this third gender in between where, I was accepted for my professional status, and we would ignore the gender issues. And so the guys who worked for me, they dealt with it by giving me a nickname. So my first name, my nickname is Masha, and they called me Mr. Mosh because, I was in charge. So I couldn't be Miss or Mrs. Mosh. I had to be Mr. Mosh. And when I, later on in my career, when I talked with women who worked in other Muslim countries, it was, they said this was very common.
So you are ambassador to Armenia, to Kyrgyzstan, and of course to Ukraine. But I want to talk a little bit with you about Russia, because you went there at a very pivotal time in the very early 90s. You experienced, hopefully you'll say something about that, what happened when Yeltsin shut up the Russian parliament. I remember a couple of years after that talking to Ambassador Thomas Pickering when I was in Moscow. He was your ambassador, and him saying, Yeltsin has to win the next election. There is no other alternative. And so the other question to you is, do you think that the US was right to back Yeltsin to the hilt, even as one could see the kind of emerging corruption and what was happening in a Russia that turned out rather differently than we thought it would?
Yeah. So, you pose a really important question, and it's one I'm still kind of grappling with. I was very junior at the time, and I don't know all of the conversations that took place behind closed doors, but certainly out in the open, we weren't really criticizing Yeltsin for some of the extra constitutional measures he was taking, and as you know, the corruption. Some of which was actually probably legal, even the loans for share scheme, for example. But does that make it right? Which is another question entirely. So I was shocked by some of the things that Yeltsin was doing, but you also have to look at the alternative. It's not as though there was going to be some great Democrat that was going to be the alternative to Yeltsin, and he or she perhaps was going to come to power and lead Russia to some mythical, really positive future. I mean, there just was nobody on the horizon, or maybe there were too many people on the horizon and they were all fighting each other on the Democratic side. The alternative was Zyuganov, the communist, supported by nationalists, far-right elements, and they would have taken the country, Russia, back to the Soviet era. There would have probably been show trials. It would have been very, very ugly. And I think, for me, I think it would have been worse for the Russian people if they had gone back, and certainly worse for the partnership with the United States. But that doesn't mean that both the Russians and the U.S. At the end of the day didn't pay a price, because when we lean too far in, or lean in to our interests, and maybe our values aren't as clearly articulated and viewed, people in other countries see that. And it affects how they view us, and it affects the relationship in general. And I would argue that it probably affected, many people in the Russian government, including those in the security service, including one Vladimir Putin. And so I think, the seeds were kind of sown for many things with the way Yeltsin ruled in the first part of the 1990s and later. I mean, that whole decade, but also to a certain extent, the impression of what it was to be to have a democracy, what capitalism was, and what that meant the U.S. was all about. I mean, I would argue that it wasn't necessarily a true understanding, but in this case, perception is reality.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I guess Yeltsin's last gift to the world was Vladimir Putin, whom he chose to succeed him for reasons that had to do with protecting his own family. But yeah, unfortunately, that's true. So you spent a lot of time in your 3 ambassadorships, certainly, and before when you were in Ukraine the first time, dealing with countries that were suffering from what we can call a post-Soviet syndrome. And these were corrupt elites who ruled these countries with these, as you described them, opaque patronage networks and managed elections where there was very little competition. And you tried very hard in all of those countries to steer the elites in the right direction. What conclusions can you now draw from all of your experiences in the post-Soviet world about why it's so difficult to get these countries to reform, to move away from these corrupt systems, which makes them much more dependent on Russia?
Yeah. Well, it is, the evil legacy of the Soviet Union, corruption, because corruption thrives if government doesn't work and doesn't provide services to the people, because people will figure out, how to get those services around the system. And of course, they're only mirroring what they see is happening on the top. And that was, where there is grand corruption. And, that was the system in the Soviet Union, and all of these countries that developed as a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That was the system they had. I mean, they didn't magically become, they had been Politburo members and leaders, of the Soviet Union. They didn't magically become something else in 1991. And so they all, maybe not all of them, but certainly the ones I dealt with, they asked us, and they asked other countries in the West to help with making their countries democratic and market economies and so forth. I mean, they had no idea what they were asking for, of course. And, as soon as the reforms started coming in, there was, big time resistance, which is not a surprise because, whenever you reform, including in countries that are not corrupt, you're breaking somebody's rice bowl. Interests are affected. And so there's going to be resistance. But there was, because all of these countries were sort of trying to build the airplane as they were flying it, so to speak. It was really difficult, and there was no education, no culture of democracy. People didn't understand the benefits that would accrue, and so as a result, I think of some of the hasty reforms that were necessary, but were not anchored by, laws and regulations to keep people safe from predators. And again, this culture of understanding what democracy is about and why it is a good thing. I mean, what people saw was chaos. And understandably, they didn't want that. What they said they wanted, nobody talks in political scientific terms on the street. What they said they wanted, they didn't ask for democracy. But what they wanted was, again, opportunity for a good job, security on the street and, for their country, opportunities for their kids. And, if the bums aren't doing a good job, they want the opportunity to kick them out and bring in a new crew, which is, what the essence of democracy, right? That's what I think people wanted. And it's not really what they got because the levers of power continue to remain in the hands of a very, very small Soviet and corrupt elite that was joined by businessmen who quickly became oligarchs as they teamed up with the politicians, and everybody became richer except for the people who were being robbed.
Do you think that might change with new generations? Because we do have younger people coming in now, but it's not clear that it's, that people are pushing for change. Let's exclude Ukraine for a moment, but look at the other countries.
So I was going to talk about Ukraine as clearly a country.
Ukraine is a different case. Yeah.
It is in many important ways, as are, of course, the Baltic countries, not that we ever recognized their inclusion in the Soviet Union. I think there are opportunities in a number of countries, but I think what we need to recognize is that transformational change, as opposed to little changes on the margins, is the work of generations. And everybody's impatient, whether it is the people of that country or politicians in the United States that want to see results faster. And it just doesn't work that way. I don't think it ever has.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's turn to your experiences when you were ambassador and then having to deal with an administration in this country that began to resemble the administration you were dealing with in Ukraine. And you obviously have a very harrowing and gripping description of your time there, dealing again with a very opaque Trump administration and people who had very much their own agendas. And anyone who reads this book is just going to have so much admiration for your tenacity and for your courage as you faced, these unprecedented attacks from people in the Trump administration and the behavior of the State Department. So I don't know which of your experiences you want to share from this, but if there are any lessons that you've drawn from this, and also, do you think that there's going to be more that we're going to find out about all of the events that led to your firing?
So I'll take the last question first. I do, because, at the time, so there had been rumors that I was going to be pulled out. The Ukrainians were the ones that were sharing this with me, and I would go back to official Washington, and official Washington, the career people at the State Department, the NSC would say, no. And in fact, during this time in March of 2019, I was actually asked to stay on longer in Ukraine by a year. So it was a very confusing time for me. And I learned a lot after I came back to the United States, and with the reporting that was being done. But during the first impeachment of Donald Trump, a lot came out then as well, and a lot has come out in subsequent books. And so, I think we are going to continue to find out more, not only about the episode with me, but just in general, more about the Trump years. I guess one of the things that I would share is that the thing that I found most troubling about this whole incident is, yes, this was my story, my sad story. It was a personal, tragedy for me to end my career in this way. But when I was pulled out, and we all know, Angela, that presidents get to name their representatives abroad and they get to fire them as well or remove them. And so there's nothing unusual about ambassadors being removed by the president and the secretary of state. What was unusual about this was the way it happened. The constant rumors and then, basically a smear campaign, which was a campaign where Ukrainian officials took part and Rudy Giuliani and those who worked with him on behalf of President Trump. And that's what kind of tipped everybody off that there must be more going on here because it wasn't necessary. They could just have told me that I had to go home and I would have had to go home because that is our system. But, first there was this big campaign accusing me of, many, many different kinds of things that, for people like us, all we have is our reputation. And so this was really, in some ways, the worst thing that could have happened to me because I didn't know whether I was going to be able to regain my reputation. So that was, my sad story. But in the implementation of this scheme, what happened is that, essentially, I was being removed because Giuliani and Trump, I guess, feared that I would get in the way of their schemes to, make it all about, Ukrainian interference in the 2016 elections and digging up dirt on the Biden family, looking forward to the 2020 elections. The Ukrainians wanted me out because they thought I was too enthusiastic, perhaps too effective on the anti-corruption front. So, it was a partnership that succeeded in removing me. But what happened is that, my colleagues, other ambassadors, my own embassy, I was implementing U.S. foreign policy. And as a result, this whole scheme ensued. And so my colleagues were wondering, who were also in various embassies around the world, they're wondering, could the same thing happen to them? Because, often we do hard things in hard places. Our policies are not always universally loved in the countries where we're at, but we are working on behalf of the American people. We are implementing our policy. But I think that, dictators saw that they could make a deal with this administration if their interests coincided, and maybe they could get rid of that pesky ambassador that they don't like anymore. And maybe they could, work a couple side deals here and there. And I think it made diplomats wonder how secure they were, because again, what was unusual about this is that the State Department didn't support me. We're used to criticism from host governments and from others. But if we're doing our jobs, we are supported by the State Department. But in this case, I was not. And so it really leaves the diplomatic corps out there dangling often in very, very exposed ways. And it undermines our foreign policy. It undermines our national security interests. And this was all done not for, the greater good of the American people. It was done because it was seen to be in the personal and political interests of Donald Trump. He was using his office for personal gain. And that's something I had seen repeatedly in countries like Somalia and the former Soviet Union. I never thought I would see it in the United States.
Yeah, the shocking when they were trying to put pressure on you to, write something saying that you supported the president, swearing your loyalty to him. That was quite shocking. And then also, I think your book brings out, this wasn't, it was largely for Trump's own re-election that they had the scheme in Ukraine. But of course, I hadn't quite realized that Poroshenko, the president at the time, he didn't, was against you too, because he wanted Trump's endorsement for his own unsuccessful, in the end, re-election bid. So they were all looking for the same things. It's quite a tangled story. So in your book, you do recount that in that very nasty phone call that Zelensky had with President Trump,
Was that the perfect phone call?
the perfect phone call. Zelensky was apparently heard to say or to agree with Trump's criticism of you. So my question to you is, have you forgiven President Zelensky? And also, how do you rate him now? How has he, maybe describe how he's kind of emerged as this great wartime leader from having been a not very effective president? And as you say in your book, people thought he was going to be pro-Russian.
Yeah. So when I, saw the transcript of that phone call, I was mightily surprised that I was the subject of that call. So Zelensky, that phone conversation took place in July. He was inaugurated in May. So he'd been president for 2 months. He was desperate for this phone call with President Trump, the president of his most important partner country. He needed to get the javelins, which, of course, everybody now knows that they are anti-tank missiles. He needed to get those javelins to Ukraine for Ukraine's defense. This was a really important call for him. And he knew what President Trump wanted, even though it wasn't always completely clear in that way that Trump has of communicating. But it was, he, I think, gave President Trump what he wanted, which was corroboration that, in fact, I was bad news and that he didn't like me either, because I think he felt he had to do it. And he's not alone in the world of leaders of other countries in terms of toadying up to Trump. And in fact, there have been some leaders here in the United States who have done the same. So I kind of put them all in this category of people who, maybe hold their nose, maybe they don't, but they just do what they think they need to do in order to get Trump on side. And Zelensky certainly had some important business to do with Trump. So I had met Zelensky a number of times as, before he announced his candidacy and then as candidate. And, he was a super smart guy. He wanted to present himself as a businessman. It was really important to him that we know that he created this multi-million-dollar production empire, a media empire, on his own, with his colleagues from Kyiv, their own blood, sweat, and tears and creativity. We didn't know whether he was going to be, what kind of a president he was going to be. He sort of ran on two things, bringing peace and ending corruption. No details. Who can argue with those two planks? How he was going to do it, he wasn't quite sure. But I think it was the protest vote. People didn't like Poroshenko. They felt that he had, he was the only oligarch of the six major oligarchs that had more money in 2019 than he had in 2014. So that tells you something, since he was also the sitting president. And he wasn't. He had done some important reforms along the way, but he wasn't living up to the promise of what the Ukrainian people wanted. And so they brought in the comedian, and he won with 73% of the vote. We didn't know what kind of a president he would be, but it was clear that that was the will of the people. And I should just note that Poroshenko did a really important thing for Ukrainian democracy by recognizing that Zelensky was the true winner of that election. And in fact, we could also note that the Ukrainians did a lot better in recognizing the winner of their presidential elections than we did in ours a year later. And that's something else that we should probably take to heart, that, we think we are the ones who have the answers when it comes to democracy and so forth. But maybe there are some things that we can learn from other countries as well. So Zelensky, as you noted, had a lot of challenges as president. And, in February of 2022, before the war, he was way down in popularity, and he was, striking out at all of his political opponents and not focused on, the bear at the door, but focused on diminishing and his political rivals, including having Poroshenko arrested. And then February 24th happened. The invasion happened. And all of a sudden he is, this is not an original quote, but Winston Churchill in khakis. I mean, in camouflage. And he is, probably the most gifted communicator of our era. He is courageous. He is committed. And he has that fluency of an actor to really understand how to connect not only with his own people, which he does every single night, but with the various audiences around the world. And he does it in a way that is relatable to each country, each particular audience. He has been so effective, not only in uniting his own people and inspiring them, but inspiring the world. And I think that's part of the reason that you see the strong support in the United States and elsewhere for Ukraine.
That's great. So my last question to you, and then we will take questions from the audience. You describe a pretty dysfunctional and sort of dismal State Department, at least by the end of your tenure there. Do you think it's reformable? What has to be done to sort of restore it to, a more effective and really fair organization?
Yeah, well, we probably don't have enough time to go into all of the things that need to be done.
3 minutes, right?
Yeah, but it's, yes, we need to reform the State Department. I think the State Department reflects, the last reforms that were, the last legislation was in 1980. But in many ways, many of our personnel policies imagine that we are still the male employee with the wife that follows around with the two beautiful children, who are all supporting the male's career. We reflect American society just like the military does, and so that no longer reflects the reality of who is at the State Department. And we need personnel policies that can attract people in and retain them. And really grow that talent so that there are, no gaps in expertise. I think that's just crucially important. But I think we also need to take a hard look at what the challenges are in 2022, because again, the State Department in some ways is a little bit stuck in time, and there are all sorts of new challenges that we never imagined. And so what are those challenges? How do we need to deal with them? What are the tools that we need? So everybody always talks about social media. That's certainly true, but maybe there are a number of other things that we should be looking at as well. And also ways that we do our work. Right now, we're so hidebound in terms of the number of approvals one needs to do just about do just about anything. Every Secretary of State, over the last 4 or 5 comes in saying, we need to take risks. We need to let our officers take risks. Sometimes they're talking about physical risks, but also the kind of risk where, let people tweet and, be there in real time responding to Russian trolls and stuff like that. But then over time, sort of the caution weighs in, and somehow we need to find a better balance between being the State Department of the United States and representing in a responsible way, but we also need to be far more nimble than we are right now. And I think the other thing is we need to and we need more resources. And the way we need to get more resources, in my opinion, is to do a better job of telling our story. We need to tell America's story overseas, but we need to tell diplomacy's story, the State Department's story in the United States to the American public so they understand what we do and why we are worthy of their support. And I think then, Congress will also want to show greater support for the State Department. I think that's critically important.
Great, thank you. So I think now we move to the question and answers, Andrea, right?
Yes. Let me get this up here. We've gotten so many questions. From the beginning of the invasion, Zelensky begged for global support. Did the U.S. and the West wait too long to give Ukraine arms and money?
So we have, I should just state up front that I actually think the Biden administration has done a pretty good job of navigating a very, very difficult challenge where, Biden has said his goals are threefold, and I think they're the right goals, which is to support Ukraine, deter Russia, and bolster the NATO's eastern flank, those frontline countries along Ukraine. But we also don't want to widen the war. And that is a pretty narrow channel to navigate. And I think that Biden, along with other world leaders, have done a really good job of managing it. The US and a number of other countries were supporting Ukraine before the war. It's arguable that we could have done a lot more earlier on. I think that in the fall, President Biden was most concerned, though, to make sure, as we could see this buildup and what was to come, he wanted to make sure that our allies and our partners were working with us in one common unit because, we are stronger when we work together, even if the actual policy isn't maybe the strongest, most perfect policy, as if we were working on our own. And so I think he put the premium on that rather than ramping up assistance earlier on, ramping up sanctions earlier on. But I think that as the war progressed from week to week, you could see our policies strengthening, and I think it continues to strengthen. And ironically, it's because of Putin's actions. Not only was he so aggressive that he wanted to swallow up all of Ukraine, the tactics that the Russian military has been using are so brutal that they have turned, not just publics, European and American publics against Russia. They've turned leaders against Russia, including even, a number of countries in Europe that have, changed decades of their foreign policy that previously would have been unimaginable. So what do we need to do now? I think we need to continue to strongly support Ukraine. We need to continue that flow of weapons, including weapons with long distance range, so that there's offset that can hit targets far, far away, and also in the Black Sea. I think that's really, really important. I think continuing our intelligence relationship important, continuing the economic assistance, and continuing to manage this crisis in a responsible way. I'd note that, there are some who are concerned that our assistance is risky, that, we could provoke Putin. But here's the thing. Putin is the aggressor in this. And he, we can't let him decide what the U.S. and our allies are going to do. And I would just note that it is also risky not to do enough. We didn't do enough in Georgia in 2008 when Russia invaded and grabbed 2 hunks of Georgia. We didn't do enough in 2014 when he invaded Ukraine and illegally annexed Crimea and started the war in the Donbass. And 8 years later, in 2022, we need to make sure that Putin is stopped in Ukraine because he has told us that he has designs not just on Ukraine, which he certainly does, but on countries further west. So this would be a real disaster if Putin prevailed in Ukraine, which I don't think he will, but if he prevailed in Ukraine and then continued on.
Before I ask the next question, should we have done a no-fly zone, that was like the one that was requested, but we held off doing so because we didn't want to provoke Putin?
That's a good question. And a lot of people have been, I guess there are pros and cons on both sides. And as a non-military person, I thought that perhaps there might be a way to do that in a way that would be for humanitarian purposes, et cetera. Ultimately, the Biden administration and others decided that was too risky. and that there were other ways of assisting Ukraine that would be less risky.
Here's a question for both of you. Is there anyone ready to take over for Putin should he suddenly die? What would his successor be like? And what would the Russian people accept?
Do you want to take that, Angela? You're the expert.
So, Putin has deliberately made sure that there is no successor. I mean, he's going to be 70 this year. He could have designated someone as a successor, but for various reasons, he doesn't want to be a lame duck. So, if he were to disappear tomorrow, there would be a power struggle, but the power struggle would probably be among the people who are surrounding him now, the 4 or 5 men who more or less share his views, and his national security advisor is sometimes even more extreme than he is, Mr. Patrushev. So I think you would expect in the short run someone coming to power that would probably pursue the same policies, although they might recognize that it's folly to go on with the war. I mean, if this happens soon, they might recognize that that their goals are unachievable. If this happens later on, you might have. I think the next iteration of this would be that you could have people coming to power who maybe are more economic technocrats and understand that it's not in Russia's interest to have such antagonistic relations with the West if it wants to have an economy that's prosperous and that functions well. But those people are not in the wings at the moment. And I don't even see, I don't see the possibility of a palace coup either. So I think you can expect much more of the same immediately going forward, although in the longer run, you could have a change.
Okay, I just lost okay, help us understand how the Russian Orthodox Church is involved with Putin's assault on Ukraine. I understand that you, Marie, attended a Russian Orthodox church growing up.
Yeah. I am Russian Orthodox. One of the ways that Putin has enhanced his popularity and his legitimacy in Russia is by tapping into these very long-held traditions and views in Russia. So, that Russia is a great nation, that, Russia deserves, Crimea and all the expansionist history of the great Russian state, et cetera. This is something that Russians take pride in. I mean, Putin came to power after 10 years of Yeltsin that, were pretty difficult for the Russian people. And they saw much of that as a humiliation of Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And Putin came to power, and he promised basically to make Russia great again. And so he's tapped into these myths of, the founding of Russia, which goes back to Kyiv, which goes back to Ukraine, where the Russian Orthodox Church was started. And, throughout Russian history, throughout the history of the Tsars, that is, obviously not in the communist history, the Russian Orthodox Church was very much, it was a state religion. It was very much intertwined with state power. And I think we are seeing that once again with the Russian Orthodox Church, where the church is supporting, Russian power. And and it's an important part of its legitimacy.
Mm-hmm. At Davos this week, Zelensky invited businesses to invest in Ukraine. Do you think investors will buy in based on, everyone's love for Zelensky?
Well, I certainly hope they do, because I think it's going to be part of the reconstruction of Ukraine. And I'm sure that at Davos there was a lot of talk about what needs to happen in order to reconstruct Ukraine once there is peace That's really important, and it's important to think about it in two ways. One is, where would the money go in terms of industries? You're not going to rebuild, the old steel plants of the 1800s. Ukraine is one of the tech capitals of the world. So where does one choose to invest, and how does one do it? I think that's one important thing. The other thing is, what kind of, how are they going to do this? Because if we were having this conversation 4 years ago, we would have been talking about corruption in Ukraine. And that has not, Ukraine didn't change just because it was invaded by Russia. And so I think that the Ukrainians need to look at this opportunity for rebuilding as a way to fundamentally do business in a different, more transparent way. That this is the new Ukraine, not only in terms of the industries that they choose to invest in, but how they do it. And that is going to be critically important, I think, in creating a Ukraine that truly is a part of the West.
This is a follow-up almost. When the crisis ends, if Zelensky is still alive, how do you see him leading and rebuilding Ukraine? It seems so massive. I'm adding that massive. Yeah. It seems.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Do you start with rebuilding the railroads or the roads? Do you start in the South, or do you start in the West? I mean, the reality is it's going to have to be done kind of all at once. And so how do you piecemeal it and create a whole? I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And my hope is that, first of all, that Zelensky survives. But secondly, that he turns out to be as great a peacetime president as he is a wartime president. I mean, often I think leaders find that the qualities, or countries find that the qualities that they're looking for in a peacetime leader are different. Often building the peace can be harder than winning the war, ironic as that sounds.
What, if anything, I think this is unrelated to any of the, what we've just been talking about. What, if anything, would you have done differently in prepping for addressing Congress?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if only I had known that President Trump was going to tweet while I was testifying. I mean, I really, I really have to hand it to my legal team. They really prepared me really very well for what was, a challenging day. I mean, that's the only way to describe it, where you're trying to imagine, what are they going to ask me? How do I handle these questions? How do I make a very complicated story clear, not only to Congress, but to the American public?
Let's end with this question. This is for both of you. Biden has been praised in the press for building up NATO and shoring up our alliances. Are you optimistic about NATO's commitment to stave off Russian advances?
Yes, I am. I think that, once again, ironically, Putin's actions have created the very opposite of what he wanted. He wanted less NATO. He's getting more NATO, not only in terms of its unity, not only in terms of refinding its focus, but I think in terms of shoring up the eastern flank, bringing in new members. I'm confident that Finland and Sweden, despite Turkish doubts at the moment, will be brought in, and I think that, I think that NATO has refound its purpose.
And I agree with that completely. There's a wonderful thing circulating on social media, and it's the NATO award for NATO Salesman of the Year, and it goes to Vladimir Putin.
Well, there you go. Thank you both so very much. This is Professor Angela Stent's book, Putin's World. And
which I support. Great book.
Yeah. And this is Lessons from the Edge, Ambassador Yovanovitch's book. Go to Skylight, go to our website to get you to Skylight to get these books. Thank you so very much. And we so appreciate your being with Writer's Block tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.